there is a huge number of other forms present there. We are talking about thousands of objects. There are studies documenting anomalies in soil resistivity beneath geoglyphs down to depths of up to 2 meters. This suggests a lack of intention to preserve existing objects as something meaningful by those who created the later ones. The same can be said about the so-called centers, from which various figures radiate in all directions. When people talk about the Nazca and Palpa plateaus, the word lines is usually used. In fact, this is not entirely correct. In addition to figures that resemble lines, there is a huge number of other forms present there. Therefore, it is more accurate to use the term geoglyphs, that is, objects created on the surface of the ground. One of the main reasons why geoglyphs are difficult to study is that there are very many of them. We are talking about thousands of objects. This indicates that when any interpretation is proposed, it must take the entire body of data into account, rather than selected convenient examples. In practice, however, things happen differently. The geoglyphs go in all directions, cross uneven terrain, run along slopes and hills, and if one wishes, they can be linked to almost anything: stars, roads, water channels, water sources, or symbolic markers. But then an inconvenient issue arises. Most of the objects have to be excluded because they begin to contradict the theory. In some places, water would have had to flow uphill. Elsewhere, a runway runs across terrain that is far too complex, and in other cases, orientations do not match. And this is already a sign that the explanation is being forced. Therefore, the next step is necessary: to attempt some form of classification of this multitude of objects. This would make it possible to analyze not each individual figure separately, but certain groups of them. In this way, both their creation and their purpose could be reduced to several typical object types that would ultimately represent the full diversity of geoglyphs. Before beginning the classification, I should note that I will rely on visual data, because these are available for the entire set of objects. For example, there are studies documenting anomalies in soil resistivity beneath geoglyphs down to depths of up to 2 meters, interpreted as a consequence of removing the desert pavement during their creation. Similar effects have been detected even beneath figures that are now barely distinguishable on the surface. However, the data come from only a limited number of test sites. The basis for visual identification of an object is the accumulation of material in the form of a continuous raised ridge or a series of separate stone piles. In some cases, these may even consist of individual large stones. In other words, the boundaries of an object will be defined by its contours formed in this manner. This principle would lead to inaccuracies if the stone ridge were formed on both sides, but such cases are extremely rare. The backbone of the classification will be visual forms based on geometric features. At the same time, it must be taken into account that satellite imagery is not flawless, and at image junctions artifacts may sometimes appear in the form of contour layering and other defects, so such imagery must be used with caution. There are examples of classifications in which geoglyphs are divided by their appearance into two categories: geometric and descriptive, which are in turn subdivided further into specific geometric forms. It is important to note that the term line in the geometric sense is not appropriate here at all. A geometric line has no width, no beginning, and no end. Here, however, we see bands of a certain width, which often emerge from figures and end within them. There is literally a single case where a line appears as a row of stone piles. This uniqueness, and the fact that no on-site investigations were conducted, makes it possible to exclude this object from analysis. In essence, we are dealing with narrow, elongated rectangular forms. Therefore, the term linear objects, or simply bands, better describes this group. Based on geometry, the following can be distinguished: linear objects, where the width is significantly smaller than the length; triangles, trapezoid, and rectangles. Changes in the direction of linear objects provide grounds for subdividing them into curves of different types. This classification divides the forms into geometric and descriptive categories. The latter represent a distinct class in terms of content. However, in terms of execution, they consist of curves constructed according to the same principles as zigzags or spirals, effectively constituting their variations. The principle of construction does not depend on the depicted content. Anthropomorphic figures, however, are executed in a different style. By method of creation, geoglyphs can be divided into contoured geoglyphs, The above-mentioned set of figures and drawings combined geoglyphs when the geoglyph is created by clearing an area. These include anthropomorphic drawings. A separate class of objects consists of estrellas. They differ in their method of manufacture. Here, the figures are formed not by stone ridges but by the placement of stones and stone piles. Manual labor is evident here. Academic science often ignores them, which is why they are not even included in classifications. There are no early mentions of them. Sometimes they are located on top of existing geoglyphs and even over tire tracks. This indicates that they should not be mixed with the main body of objects. This is a different type. The next point to pay attention to is that figures often overlap each other. This indicates that some were created on top of others. This seemingly trivial observation immediately provides some answers. For example, later geoglyphs erased not only similar ones but also more complex forms, such as spirals or drawings, as a result of which some of them were irreversibly damaged. This suggests a lack of intention to preserve existing objects as something meaningful by those who created the later ones. Alternatively, a possible reason for the erasure could have been a lack of awareness of the existence of earlier geoglyphs. At the same time, in some cases, drawings are inscribed within an existing figure, preserving both forms as much as possible. That is, in some cases drawings were destroyed, while in others they were deliberately emphasized. From this it follows that the entire set of objects is the result of processes extended over time, expressed through layers placed one above another. Consequently, they could have been created by different authors for different purposes. This gives rise to the task of separating one group from another. Something similar can be observed in buildings, where a structure, existing over a long period of time, undergoes repairs and reconstructions due to repeated use. But in the case of buildings, it is easier to distinguish changes in time based on the relative positions of layers of different styles and methods of stonework. Analysis of the geoglyphs shows that they too have a certain style, expressed through regularities in their creation, and this makes it possible to carry out their differentiation. Each type of figure has its own characteristic properties. For example, triangles are always isosceles, and their base is always located lower than the apex. In most cases, a line extends from the apex, forming zigzags and ending in a spiral or a drawing. In such cases, a stable combination of several objects is observed. The same can be said about the so-called centers, from which various figures radiate in all directions. At present, dozens of such centers are known, and their distinguishing feature is their location on some elevation. At the same time, only a portion of the geoglyphs are connected to these centers, while others exist in separate groups. Rectangles tend to be located on flat areas of the terrain and have stone platforms at their bases. Trapezoids, which somewhat resemble a triangle with a truncated apex, have two such platforms. At the same time, the width of a trapezoid can vary from considerable to comparable with that of a linear object. Most figures are not independent. They are connected to each other in a way that strings them together one after another. An important property of the linear object is their constant width, which changes abruptly when transitioning into a figure. Bands also do not exhibit self-intersections or closed contours. In many drawings formed by bands, continuous movement is used, with a single entry and exit point. The exception is the eyes. Branching is also not characteristic of bands. Listing all the properties of the objects hardly makes sense, as this would be of interest only for a serious in-depth analysis of the topic and would be excessive in the present exposition. The listed properties make it possible to separate objects that do not conform to such characteristics or methods of creation. For example, numerous anthropomorphic figures on slopes are formed using a completely different technique, not by a continuous band, but by clearing the ground of stones. Linearity as such is absent here. The same applies to the notable double spiral, where the zigzags show significant variations in width, and in the center of the figure from which they emerge, branching is observed. Therefore, this combination can be classified as imitation, although it is not excluded that its basis was some earlier existing object. In that case, it would be more accurate to speak of a modification, but with a loss of the original construction rules. Thus, geoglyphs can be differentiated by noting that even where there is similarity of form or of the underlying idea, differences are observed in methods of creation and in the internal characteristics of the objects. If we address the question of how geoglyphs were created, It should be noted that they are not found at any significant distance from settlements, although there are plenty of mountain slopes suitable for their construction. That is, geoglyphs are tied to places of human habitation. It is evident that many structural elements are characteristic results of manual labor, such as large vertically placed stones, sometimes surrounded by smaller ones. It is difficult to imagine the formation of such features by purely mechanical means without human involvement. The same applies to separate stone piles that form contours. In mechanical production, one would logically expect a continuous stone ridge. And even if we assume some periodic dumping due to the filling of a receiving hopper, the piles would be approximately equal in volume, and the spacing would be strictly related to the density of stones on the surface. In reality, they vary in size, and their placement shows no strict system. Another characteristic indicating manual labor is that with some automated execution, when crossing an existing geoglyph, its displaced stones would be redistributed along the new path in one direction each time, consistently. In reality, numerous variations are observed. Stones are distributed in different directions, or sometimes in one direction, indicating the absence of a systematic method. It might seem that the optimal solution would be to create an intersection with a clean internal area. However, when creating a new object, preservation of the previous one was apparently not always a priority, and stone ridges were formed on its surface as well. That is, the new figure had priority. In cases where the intersection is made without disturbing stone ridges, one can speak of deliberate clearing. Adhering to alternative viewpoints, one might assume that all subsequent geoglyphs are imitations of the primary ones created during the Paracas period, or even earlier. But even in that case, it must still be acknowledged that the main mass of geoglyphs was created over a long period of time. In some instances, it is even visible how an unfinished object is overlain by a conditionally completed one, confirming that geoglyphs were created sequentially. The same is indicated by the disturbed boundaries of many figures. Such a result is natural when an existing geoglyph is expanded by shifting its boundaries. The work was suddenly interrupted, and as a result it acquired the appearance of an incomplete construction. Therefore, a huge number of geoglyphs remained unfinished. Sometimes only the contours were marked, and stone piles were prepared over a certain area. There is an opinion that the concept of completeness is not applicable at all to objects that were constantly modified. When creating geoglyphs, their depth may be significant or absent, especially when the contours are marked by individual stones or piles. This is natural, since without substantial stone ridges, material was not removed from the surface, leaving no source for depth to appear. In some cases, the surface may appear lighter due to the exposure of pale sand from which darker stones covered with desert varnish have been removed. However, this effect is largely the result of modern activity. Since their creation many centuries ago, the original contrast has diminished. For this reason, geoglyphs have been cleared both during research and to enhance their visibility for tourists. In the case of complex terrain, geoglyphs lose the perfection of their forms. The reason may lie both in the increased difficulty of the work and in erosion processes on slopes. Considering the fact that geoglyphs were venerated while simultaneously being created and modified for more than 1,000 years, the work of constructing them ceases to appear something incredible. As experiments show, creating such a figure is entirely feasible. Therefore, several geoglyphs per year, even for a limited population, is a manageable task, since most figures are not that large. Moreover, if later transformations cannot be distinguished from conditionally original ones, this means there is no basis to speak of some ancient unsurpassed objects, since they were repeatedly reproduced. The execution of the drawings also indicates manual labor. One often hears the idea that they were created using computer algorithms and Bezier curves. But it should be said that a Bezier curve corresponds to any smooth contour. That is precisely why it was created. If a drawing can be traced with a Bezier spline, this does not mean it was designed using computer calculations. It only indicates that it contains no sharp breaks. One could speak of computer modeling if there were strict adherence to exact radii, standardization, and so on, all the features we see in technical drawings. In that case, the drawing would transform into something more rigid. And at the same time, it would lose the originality inherent in creative work, since deviations create visual appeal, while simultaneously disproving mysticism. Of course, those who created the geoglyphs, just as in the case of polycurve masonry, had to follow strict rules. Otherwise, a different result would be obtained. Just as when reproducing polycurve masonry, one gets a similar result but with a different style and absence of certain features. And this is precisely what is observed, different figures and their combinations corresponding to different epochs. One cannot say that all geoglyphs are standardized either in execution or in meaning. On the contrary, they are diverse in every respect. This applies not only to individual figures but also to their combinations. What is stable here is only their conjunction. But the relative positions of elements, their sizes, and trajectories differ radically. Therefore, it is unjustified to search for a single explanation for absolutely all geoglyphs. Meanings could and likely did change together with forms. For example, one might imagine that a triangle pointing upward could symbolize life, development, or achievement. The accompanying zigzag, certain stages, and the spiral or drawing, a symbol of unification of path and goal, of the primordial source of all things. Naturally, this interpretation is entirely speculative and is given only to demonstrate that the idea behind the creation of geoglyphs may have contained distinct symbolism for each group. That is, rectangles, trapezoids, or centers would have had different meanings, which could also have been modified over time. Thus, the entire plateau represents a sheet of paper on which each generation created symbols again and again over existing ones. As a result, the entire accumulation cannot be deciphered as a single whole. Dating has been carried out using various available methods: thermoluminescence dating for the direct determination of the age of stones, and indirect approaches based on associated materials, including radiocarbon dating, and most extensively, the analysis of ceramics found on the surface of the geoglyphs. The latter method, however, provides only a minimum age estimate, which nevertheless allows for the identification of different periods of creation. At the same time, the earliest period, the initial Nazca phase, around the 1st century CE, is associated with anthropomorphic figures executed in a combined style, which differ from geometric form. Moreover, there are no recorded cases where such drawings are superimposed on existing geoglyphs, which indicates their primacy. The earliest examples are dated to the same period. I will mention some features that have no explanation, as well as some characteristics that are more imagined than actually existing. There is a belief that the geoglyphs were created from the air, since they are visible only from a certain height, and only from above could their creation be controlled. According to such reasoning, agricultural fields, roads, and some structures must also have been created from the air, since they have regular contours, consistent orientation, and are clearly visible. Moreover, if the figures had been created by some fantastic beam, one would logically expect to see the result of the beam's movement regardless of terrain. But the opposite situation is observed. Contours do not extend beyond cliffs, instead turning before them, which indicates attachment to the surface. Another claim is that some figures near slopes change their appearance, as if the force that created them came from a certain height at an angle to the surface. In reality, this more likely concerns damage to these figures caused by local landslides or by intentional clearing of passages where people move. Another assumption concerns the idea that enormous volumes of soil were moved in creating the figures. In fact, since the figures end before changes in elevation, an impression of large-scale soil displacement arises. Another point is the belief that geoglyphs possess some kind of intensity, and that their appearance changes depending on surface level, which manifests itself at intersections with other figures, as if the deeper they are located, the less they are affected. If this were true, it would be observed everywhere, since geoglyphs often pass across elevation changes. But such regularities are not observed. Individual cases are no more than limitations of image quality or the result of later modifications. The bases of triangles sometimes appear layered, forming successive stone ridges. This looks like overlapping identical figures with displacement. It occurs because zigzags often pass beyond the base. With later modification of the figure, a layering effect at the base may arise. As can be seen, the listed features do not have a regular character, and often rely more on imagination than on reality. But there are others. Some of them are as follows. The width of stone ridges does not depend on the size of the figure. This is unusual, since changing the width would affect the volume of removed stone. According to the accepted view, supported by unfinished figures, the perimeter was first marked, and then the stone ridges were formed, which is why they appear uniform. Stones from the inner area were gathered into piles, which were later removed. This raises the question, where were they distributed? If evenly along the stone ridges, then in the case of a large area figure, these ridges would become considerably higher, which is not observed. For example, in the modified double spiral, an increase in stone density outside the cleared areas can be seen, but in many geoglyphs it is impossible to trace where the stones were moved. There are large-scale figures created by clearing the surface of stones, yet it is not visible that the stones were distributed around them. This reinforces the impression that stones are missing. In reality, this effect may arise because stones were not piled together, but, if small, were pressed into the sand, and over time may appear to have disappeared. Alternatively, this phenomenon would have to be explained by transportation over some distance, which indeed requires additional effort. It should be noted that clear answers to these questions are lacking not for supernatural reasons, but because no targeted on-site investigations have been carried out to find them. A somewhat different issue concerns the opinion sometimes expressed that the drawings are atypical for the Nazca culture, to which their creation is attributed. The difficulty lies in explaining the emergence of a method in which the entire image is formed by a single continuous bands without self-intersections. Such a style would have had to develop gradually, yet this development is not traceable in ceramics or textiles. On the contrary, those media display images that correspond well to the anthropomorphic geoglyphs executed according to different principles. To create a drawing, one must have a stable image, either physical, in the form of a sketch, or mental. An experienced artist is capable of depicting a large object without using a scaling grid, since the scale is determined by the contour itself. Importantly, all details of the plateau drawings lie within direct visibility. Despite their impressive dimensions, visual control is possible. Their gigantic scale is achieved mainly through elongated linear elements such as the neck. The core portion of the image is in fact much smaller and comparable in size to the facades of modern buildings, which are likewise often vividly decorated. Thus, the key question is where the ideas behind these drawings originated, how their distinctive style emerged, and why some of the images as a whole are not characteristic of Peru. Many interpretations of the Nazca geoglyphs assume that they are images created for visual perception. However, the very nature of these forms calls this assumption into question. In choreography, the subject of depiction is usually the dancing figures themselves, not the trajectories of their arms and legs. In music, representations traditionally show performers and instruments, not the movement of the conductor's baton or the structure of the sound sequence. Especially in periods preceding musical notation, a musical work existed as an action rather than as a graphic record. Similarly, in the case of Nazca, we are apparently dealing not with images in the strict sense, but with a spatial fixation of actions. The bands and figures function as movement routes, a kind of logistical trajectory. They possess a key property. One can walk them from beginning to end. If one carefully traces the contour of images on ceramics, a drawing of the required type can easily be obtained. The geoglyphs can certainly be associated with animals, symbols, or signs. However, judging by the conditions of perception, these images were likely not the primary goal. In many cases, a full visual overview of the figures from ground level is impossible or significantly hindered. This suggests that visual representation was not primary. Rather, what mattered was the execution of an action according to a predetermined spatial scheme. The task was to create a route. In other words, the geoglyphs function not as pictures but as graphic records of procedures, a kind of score for movement implemented in the landscape. The so-called estrelles differ from the main body of geoglyphs precisely in that they cannot be traversed continuously, just like the anthropomorphic figures. This leads to three distinct classes of objects, which should be analyzed separately. Thank you for watching. See you next time.